Beat 'em ups. They're great, right? I mean, who hasn't spent hours in the arcades and rolls of quarters on games like Final Fight, Double Dragon, or perhaps even Crime Fighters? But how many times can you play a game where you're part of a small group of vigilantes that's out to eradicate groups of gangs infesting the city that, for whatever reason, the police are powerless to take care of via normal methods? Well, I mean, personally, I can do that forever. That type of game never gets old to me. I still, to this day, enjoy dropping a quarter in one of those classic machines in the arcade, or perhaps playing one of the newer releases in the genre, like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Shredder's Revenge, or maybe Streets of Rage 4, that was such a special long-awaited release for so many people that I had to cover it on the channel, even though it technically doesn't fit with all the other reviews that I've done. But even as enjoyable as these types of games are, sometimes you need to do something a little bit different. Perhaps to try to attract a new audience, or simply give gamers a new experience to ooh and ah over, all while still giving the rush of pounding an enemy into the dirt. Hi, my name is Dave, and welcome to Zilog and Moto, the channel where I've got one chief mission, and that is to collect and review complete copies of every English language game released for the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega or Mega CD as the case may be, and finally the 32X. Basically, if I can plug it into a Genesis, either by itself or with some sort of add-on, and be able to read what's on the screen, I'm trying to get a copy of it and review it for posterity, with both looks at the original packaging and then gameplay captured from original hardware whenever possible, which is basically all the time except for light gun games. Those I do use emulation to handle. Emulation is fine, really. Play how you want to play, because if most of these games and consoles were athletes, they'd already be retired, they're so old. What does that say about me? You know what, let's move on before AARP calls again, shall we? I mentioned Streets of Rage 4 earlier, and of course that game exists due to the original Streets of Rage on the Genesis, which in turn was clearly Sega's response to Final Fight being available for the Super Nintendo. Streets of Rage is an excellent 16-bit beat-em-up that's been covered by just about everyone over the years, including by yours truly back in episode 163, and if you missed that, definitely go check it out. But one of the reasons why it was such a good title is that even though it was the first game in the Streets of Rage series, it was not Sega's first attempt at a beat-em-up on the Genesis. No, that game would be the game that we are talking about in today's review, Golden Axe. Golden Axe is of course a port of the Sega arcade machine, which made its debut in the summer of 1989 on System 16 hardware and was an instant success, providing gamers with that tried and true beat-em-up gameplay. But instead of fighting wave after wave of roaming gangs, like your home is on Coney Island, the game had a sword and sorcery theme, with you taking control of either the barbarian axe battler, who ironically doesn't use an axe, so more on that to come, the Amazon Tyrus Flare, or finally the dwarf Gilius Thunderhead, in 1 or 2 player action. With that success and the game coming from the System 16, it was a natural port to the Sega for the Genesis, with the game first appearing in Japan and the United States in around Christmas of 1989, and then eventually making its way to Europe as well. With the game being a very early release for the console, was Sega able to pack that full 16-bit punch of the arcade machine into only 4 megabits? Or did Sega's R&D 2 bite off a little bit more than they could chew? Well, we should see, but first a look at the package.
And this is my copy of Golden Axe for the Genesis. And it's in pretty decent shape. Certainly not perfect, but could be a lot worse. The hang tab has been removed at the top, but at least whoever did it made a clean cut, and the outer cover is fully intact with no scratching or any other damage. The inner cover is held up pretty well also, with no water damage or sun bleaching, but unfortunately there is some wear at the top where it looks like that maybe at some point that top edge slid out and was unprotected. The cartridge and manual, as we'll get to in a minute, are in decent shape as well, so I doubt I'll be looking for a better copy unless I just happen to stumble onto one for a great price. But if you are looking for a complete copy of Golden Axe for your own, they're currently going for between $40 and $50. So not too expensive for a game this well known and of this vintage, but not cheap either, which is why I'm okay at holding on to this one. As far as that front cover goes, it is a thing of beauty. This is really one of the truly iconic covers of the early Genesis. even though it kind of misses the mark a bit when it comes to accurately representing the characters in the game. Which, I mean, it happened sometimes with the games from back then. They'd farm out the art to someone who'd never seen the game before, and then they kind of just made their best guess based on the description that they were given. Which leads to us having Axe Battler holding an axe and looking much more like a Conan ripoff, and Tyrus looking like she went to the same hairstylist as Blackie Lawless. To my point about the artist, I mean, come on. I mean, the guy's name is Axe Battler. Of course, if you went to any artist and told them, hey, draw a picture of a guy named Axe Battler, they would draw a picture of someone holding an axe. It's just common sense. So I'm putting that one squarely on the game designers. Regardless of the inaccuracies, I love this art, especially with the dragon's eyes lurking in the background, and this was actually put on one of the early posters that was included with the games, and that's definitely befitting of going on a wall somewhere. For comparison's sake, the Japanese and European covers use a different painting, and it's okay, but oddly Axe Battler is still a blonde, and the posing of the characters is unnatural at best. This was the era of the Japanese releases having separate rear art, and that is actually pretty cool, but of course this only appeared in Japan. Flipping over to the rear of the US version, it uses the same formatting of other early US releases, with one large picture and then two smaller ones below. The quality of the screenshots is actually really good for the time. The flavor text, though, isn't quite as good. I suppose it doesn't do a bad job of describing the game, and hits the fact that the Genesis version apparently has 2 levels that the arcade version didn't, which is pretty huge, as usually the home ports would have less levels, as we just saw with Bonanza Bros a few episodes ago. But then there's no mention of the characters' actual names, and refers to Axe Battler as a warrior instead of a barbarian. I don't know, again, it's not bad, but when you read a tagline like, "So far, the score is Death Adder, thousands. You, 0. It's time to change the score." It's clear that this could have used a little bit more work. Opening up the package and the cartridge and manual are in really nice shape. The manual is a pretty standard early Genesis manual that opens with the background of the game and then flows into the gameplay. The game is explained very thoroughly for what's a relatively simple game, even going into breaking down the combat combos. And then there's plenty of screenshots and concept art to illustrate things, culminating in a level breakdown, some gameplay tips, and finally the traditional high score logs at the end. Okay, that's the package. Let's hack and slash it up and see just how good a job Sega R&D 2 did with this apparently enhanced port. As you've probably figured out at this point, Golden Axe is an arcade beat-em-up very much inspired by the 80s string of popular sword and sorcery action films like Conan the Barbarian, Red Sonja, and maybe even throw in the Beastmaster as well for good measure. It's certainly not the only game or series to come from that genre, as we've already taken a look at the Rastan games on both the Master System and the Genesis, but it definitely was one of the most successful, spawning not just the original game and its port that's being discussed today, but also 2 sequels on the Mega Drive/Genesis, separate Game Gear and Master System spin-offs, 2 additional arcade games, and then finally an attempted series reboot in 2008 that's probably best left ignored. The original game in the series is based around the exploits of 3 characters: Axe Battler, a confusingly named, somewhat generic barbarian, Tyrus Flare, an Amazonian sword mistress that's clearly based on Red Sonja, and finally, Gilius Thunderhead, a dwarf that appears to have been pulled directly from the configuration files in Gauntlet. In one of those charming translation issues from the era, it's somewhat confusing as to why the characters are on their mission to take down the big bad. If you only pay attention to what's shown in game, each character states in a monologue at the beginning of the game that they have taken up the mission to free the land from Death Adder because their friend, Alex Kidd, was murdered by him. Okay, fine, it doesn't really say Alex Kidd, it just says Alex, but come on, do you really think Alex was a common name in Uria? Do the math, people. Also, there's an in-game cutscene that shows this in the arcade version, where you see a bloody Alex die in front of you after he tells you that Death Adder's to blame, which kind of kills my joke because clearly it's not Alex Kidd that gets murdered, but just pretend that doesn't exist, like Sega R&D 2 did when porting this game. Conflicting with what's shown in game, the manual states that Tyrus saw her mother and father murdered by Death Adder, Gilius lost his brother, and Axe had to listen to his mom die. Brutal. Regardless of who had their last breath, Death Adder clearly pissed off the wrong group of people, and now the trio is out to set things right, either one at a time or in two-player mode. In a concept utilized by other beat-em-ups at the time, not all the characters are created equal, so you'll want to take some care in picking out a character besides just which one you think looks the coolest. The first difference that you'll probably notice when playing the game is the character's speed. And unlike in something like Streets of Rage, the speed component isn't necessarily related to how fast the characters move around the screen as much as how quick their attacks come out. That might not seem like a big deal on the surface, but when you get into one-on-one competition with an enemy, it's absolutely critical that you be able to land the first blow, because otherwise you're going to end up in the dirt down a health bar very quickly, and health is more valuable in this game than in other beat-em-ups, for reasons that I'll get to in a minute. The end result is Axe Battler, who's slower than Tyrus and Gilius, is almost unplayable, and should probably be reserved for use for only by players that want a challenge, or that are teaming up with someone else in two-player mode. I don't necessarily think that's a good or a bad thing, as the characters definitely should have some differences to allow players to choose someone that's going to give them a different experience, and possibly better fit their playstyle. But I do think that perhaps Axe Battler could have been made a bit stronger to better balance that out, because it doesn't seem like that he can take more damage than anyone else or dish out more punishment. Another big difference between the characters is their use of magic. Well, you can't do a sword and sorcery type title without actually having the sorcery, now can you? To further differentiate the characters, Axe uses earth-based magic, Gilius uses lightning-based magic, hence the surname Thunderhead, and finally Tyrus uses fire-based magic, again, hence the surname Flare. Could they have changed Axe's name to Rock Battler? I mean, that would have fixed the weapon confusion and linked him to his magic style. It's just a thought. I mean, Sega, feel free to call me. I'm sure I've got others I could help you with. Anyway, the type of magic used doesn't have any advanced characteristics, like perhaps doing more damage depending on an enemy's weakness, but there is definitely strategy to be used as far as when it comes to choosing when to lower the boom on an enemy. When starting the game, each character begins with one magic pot, which allows them to use their base magic attack. But as you progress through the game, you'll run into sneaky elves that carry more, usually between levels, which allows you to collect more pots and power up your magic attack. However, each character has a different maximum magic level, meaning that not only will their maximum attack be stronger or weaker, depending on who you choose if they're fully maxed out, but also characters are limited in how many pots they can carry at one time. As a result, good players will learn that, depending on which character they have chosen, that they may need to use magic more often, or else have it wasted due to the limited inventory. And since magic is only collected, and not given back when you die, a la the special attack in the original Streets of Rage, it doesn't necessarily benefit you to use it before you lose a life, unless you're going to have to burn to continue. Along those same lines is the player's health bar. In most beat-em-ups, when you finish a level, you're rewarded by getting your health bar refilled before you go back into battle. Not so in Golden Axe. If you're barely clinging to life with one health bar when you finish a level, when you go back into battle, you're still only going to have that one bar, unless there's an elf or two with meat instead of magic pots between the levels. This is what I was referring to earlier when I said that a player's health is more valuable in Golden Axe than in other beat-em-ups. Because with the limited opportunities to regain health, and no extra lives, players could be one disastrous fight against a skeleton army away from game over. I'm sure there's players out there that don't like this approach, or that think that it makes the game too hard, but I actually like it, and it makes the game feel like a more cohesive adventure rather than just a bunch of isolated events. And to be honest, Golden Axe isn't a very long game, so it makes sense that Sega would have to tweak a few things to keep players from just walking straight through and moving on, repeating the mistake that Altered Beast made. Having said that, when talking about the Genesis version, you have to mention the fact that Sega knew that they needed to give players something extra with the home port, and that is the 2 extra levels that they mentioned on the back of the package. When playing through the game, fans of the arcade version will feel pretty at home, until the fight with Death Adder, that is. Or should I say Death Adder Jr. You see, rather than letting the game end at that point, Sega allowed players to rescue the king and princess, just as in the arcade version, but then the game sends you into a mysterious large door to fight through 2 more levels before getting to the true version of Death Adder. I think this was handled perfectly on Sega's part because as a quarter muncher the game was fine as was, but when playing it at home, the first 6 levels can be run through in just 25 minutes, which is not ideal, and the 2 new levels fit in perfectly with the rest of the game. Sega didn't stop there though, they also added 2 new game modes to the home version as well. The first isn't that noteworthy, but when you go to boot up the game, you'll have a choice labeled as Beginner. Beginner is a 3-level version of the game, with Death Adder Jr. inserted as the final boss, for players to practice with and learn the game. Even though it's not really a different game experience, it is nice that Sega added it because, other than controlling the amount of health bars that a character starts with, there are no actual difficulty choices in the main game. So young players, or players that really want to practice, would definitely want to take advantage of Beginner mode. The other new game mode is The Duel. Not to be confused with the eventual arcade and Saturn sequel of the same name, The Duel is a game mode whereby players can either take on up to 12 rounds of different computer-controlled competition, or fight against one another. It's a fun diversion from the main game, and again can allow players to practice their combat skills against a variety of enemies. From a graphics perspective, Golden Axe looks fantastic, especially when you take into consideration the limited amount of space the designers had on the cartridge. Remember, this was an early Genesis release, and as such, Sega R&D 2 had to cram everything into only 4 megabits. When compared directly to the arcade version, it's missing some detail, and the characters appear to have less animation, but I think it looks like a pretty close replica, and the designers did a good job of getting the most out of the Genesis limited color palette. Not only does the game look close to the arcade version, all of the level layouts are the same as well, complete with the holes and pits to take advantage of, and to avoid. Even the large boss sprites are fully intact, and it shouldn't be understated how much having those large sprites make the game truly feel like you're playing something that was in the arcades, and definitely not something that you were going to be able to do just on an NES. Having said that, with the game being the arcade hit that it was, it shouldn't be too surprising to hear that it was ported to all of the usual 8 and 16-bit home computers, along with the Master System and the PC Engine CD. And honestly, the Genesis version is definitely the best looking of the bunch. The Amiga version is close, and a few of them have decent representations of the game's soundtrack, but the Genesis version definitely gets the closest to the arcade. And of note, the PC Engine CD version, other than having a cool intro, looks especially bad, and something that I was surprised to see. Speaking of audio, one of the strengths of the arcade game was its sound, and as the game featured both a booming soundtrack and some nice sound effects. The Genesis version, unsurprisingly, doesn't quite live up to the arcade version, again being limited by cartridge space, but I will say that the soundtrack on the Genesis is specifically still pretty great. This is one of those games that deserves the notoriety of having a vinyl version of the soundtrack, and the fact that they were able to produce something of this quality this early in the console's lifespan is pretty impressive. The sound effects aren't as notable as the music, and definitely aren't anywhere near as impressive as what you're hearing in the arcade version, but they're not bad, and they fit the game's action well. When playing Golden Axe this week, I was taken aback a bit by just how well the game is held up. Sure, it's simple, sure, it's relatively short, but so was the arcade game, and it's a lot deeper experience than a certain launch title for the console. There's a few things that I don't love about it, with probably my biggest annoyance being how hard it can be to lock up with an enemy when you're trying to be evasive, which is kind of a requirement of surviving, as anyone that tries to Leroy Jenkins Golden Axe is not going to end up with a chicken. And if I have to explain this reference, you clearly haven't spent enough time on the internet. Ultimately though, Golden Axe is a port that's arguably better than the arcade version in a lot of ways, and it's a game that broke ground for the genre long before games like Knights of the Round and Dungeons & Dragons Tower of Doom came on the scene. As a result, I'm giving Golden Axe 4 stars, as it was a groundbreaking title that truly brought the arcade experience home and helped put the Genesis on the map in North America that first year.
Okay, and that is it for Golden Axe on the Genesis. Now, this will not be the last time we hear from the Golden Axe series on the channel, as there is still the direct sequel Golden Axe 2, and perhaps I'll even review Golden Axe 3, even though it technically didn't get a physical release outside of Japan. Not to mention the series releases on the Master System as well, assuming that I can afford a copy of Golden Axe Warrior at some point. Yikes. I honestly can't remember if I ever played Golden Axe 2, and I'm definitely curious about how the Master System version held up after having seen good ports of early Genesis titles to the Master System like Forgotten Worlds, and then ports that never should have happened like Altered Beast. Next time on the channel, it is Thanksgiving. Well, here in the United States anyway, so I'll be taking a brief break from working on the channel, but I'll be back at it soon enough and should have another review out late next week as we get closer to the Season 5 wrap-up video at the end of the year. Having said that, since it's Thanksgiving, one of the things most associated with Thanksgiving in the United States, outside of eating that is football. So I think this will be a good opportunity to get a football game on the schedule that's not from one of the series that we've looked at before. This usually gets pretty dicey, and the last time that I reviewed a football game that wasn't from Sega or Electronic Arts, the result was Pro Quarterback from Tradewest back in episode 166. Fingers crossed that this game is able to bring a little more power to the table. Well, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 219. If you like what you saw here and want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you are so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun and be excellent to each other. Later.